Now we're going to talk about a couple of women who were living in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The first one is Rosa Parks. She was a seamstress in Montgomery. Now, you all know the story. You all know the story. You know what's coming. That Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the public bus and was arrested, and that turned into a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement, which is all true. You may not have had the full story, though. This is how I expect many of you have heard this story. Rosa Parks was this elderly seamstress. Most people think she was elderly when they think on this incident. She was not. She was 42 years old. But anyway, she was a seamstress, and she got on the bus, and she was tired because she had worked all day. And the rule was that black people had to sit at the back of the bus, white people in the front of the bus. And if you were black and you were sitting toward the back, and all the seats in front for the white people filled up, and then more white people got on, you had to get up and move farther to the back and give them your seat. And if there are no more seats, you have to just stand in the aisle and give the white person your seat. Okay, so the story most of us are familiar with. She was tired. She was older, and she just didn't. She was just too tired. She just didn't feel like getting up this time. There's a lot more to it than that. Rosa Parks, well, first of all, like I said, she was not elderly. She was 42 years old, and that's a picture of her in 1955. She was, in addition to being a seamstress by trade, she also was the secretary to the local chair of the NAACP, E.D. Nixon. And the NAACP had been coordinating with a couple of local preachers, Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr., who was actually in the picture there just over Rosa Parks's shoulder. And they had been planning to take some action to challenge the constitutionality of Montgomery's bus laws, their segregated bus laws, similar to what Homer Plessy and his companions had planned back in the 1890s. So this was something that was in the works. In fact, in 1954, Rosa Parks and Dr. King both went to Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. We talked about that earlier. That's the school that Miles Horton had been running since the early 1930s to train organizers, and they had gone through the program there to learn how to be organizers. So this was not just a total, complete spur of the moment, gee, I'm tired today kind of thing. However, another aspect of the story that a lot of people are unfamiliar with is the fact that Rosa Parks wasn't the first person to have that experience and to do that. And in fact, she wasn't even the first person that year. In March of 1955, this young woman, Claudette Colvin, who was a 15-year-old high school student. This is a picture of her in 1954. She was a high school student, and she rode the public bus to get back and forth to school. And one day, she was on the bus one day in March, and another lady had sat down next to her, a pregnant African American lady, and more white people got on the bus, and they were told to get up and move. And the pregnant lady put up some argument because she was pregnant and she was tired and didn't feel like getting up. And Claudette said, "Well, I'm not getting up either." Now, Claudette was a member of the NAACP Youth Council. And she had just been studying about important moments in civil rights history. And she said later she felt like that Sojourner Truth was standing behind her, pushing down on her shoulder to keep her from getting up on one side, and Harriet Tubman on the other. So she didn't get up, and she was arrested, and she put up quite a quite a bit of vocal resistance. She was pretty loud. She was sometimes, when she was angry, prone to swearing, and so she got arrested, and she was one of several people who were involved in a case that was taken to the courts about the bus segregation. However, the local chapter of the NAACP decided that they didn't really want to focus on her, that she wasn't the case they were looking for, because by the time it was all ready to come to the courts, she was pregnant. She was 15 years old, unmarried, a teenager, and was pregnant. And that didn't present the best face for the movement. White people, they believed, would pounce on that, and that would undermine their credibility. So they didn't put the spotlight on her. They decided to wait and have, well, for lack of a better term, from their perspective, a, quote, better example to focus on. Then, in December of that year, 1955, Rosa Parks, and this part of the story is true, she had been working all day, and she got on the bus, and she was tired, and she was told to get up and move. The part most people aren't familiar with is all that backstory that I just told you, and the fact that this isn't something that was purely spontaneous. It's something that she had been a part of planning for some time. Now, it was kind of spontaneous in that on this particular occasion, she decided, well, okay, today's the day, and I'm the person. And so she did refuse to get up, and she was arrested. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He was born in 1929 in Atlanta. That means that at this time, he was 25, 26 years old, and he had accomplished a lot in that time. He had a bachelor's degree, a BA in sociology from Morehouse College, and he had a bachelor's of divinity from the Crozer Theological Seminary, and he was in the process of getting his PhD when all this started from Boston University in systematic theology. He was awarded his PhD in June 1955, so 6 months before Rosa Parks' historic arrest. In 1954, he had left Boston University, finishing up his dissertation, and accepted a position as pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. Now, of course, as a Baptist preacher, his biggest influence was Jesus. He also, though, was heavily influenced by Gandhi and by someone else who had been influenced by Gandhi, Bayard Rustin, the guy that we talked about, who was a member of CORE and was a part of that journey of reconciliation and first freedom rides back in 1947. Well, after Parks was arrested, King, who had already been coordinating and planning a massive bus boycott when the time was right, with E.D. Nixon, the local NAACP chair, and another Baptist minister in town named Ralph Abernathy. Immediately, they set this plan into action after Rosa Parks was arrested, and Dr. King was often the point person, as it were, the person who spoke to the media, because, and this may come as a surprise to you, he was a pretty good speaker. He had quite a bit of presence. So this boycott started, in which the African American population of Montgomery, in protest over the segregation of the bus system, stopped taking the bus and walked to work or carpooled. And that seems like a small thing, but there was a really large black population in Montgomery, and a large percentage of them didn't have cars and regularly rode the bus. When they stop riding the bus starts losing money. And this was the city bus, this was the public transit system. So the city starts losing money and continued losing money. As Dr. King is being interviewed often, and that is being transmitted, around the country, and more attention is being focused on this movement in Montgomery, Alabama. Bayard Rustin, one of his heroes, came down and joined them, and he became part of the protest. This boycott lasted for over a year, and over the course of that time, 156 protesters were arrested, and that was really the least of dangers presented to protesters. There was a group formed called the White Citizens Council that essentially was in place to teach those upstart black people, those uppity black people, a lesson. And they frequently beat up protesters and, on several occasions, set fire or actually bombed the homes of African Americans in Montgomery. Despite that, however, the legal process marched on as this suit went to a district court and then went up to the Supreme Court in 1956. And the Supreme Court ruled, remember, this is the court presided over by Chief Justice Earl Warren, who just a year before, or 2 years before, had made that ruling on Brown versus the Board of Education. They ruled that it is unconstitutional for local governments to have segregation policies on public transportation. Now, that's a big thing, right? Because the education decision that pertains to kids, that pertains to kids not having equal accommodations. Well, this is something different. This is adults. It's basically saying that, well, by implication, if local governments and by extension state governments don't have the constitutional right to have segregation requirements in their transportation, do they have a right to do so with anything? So that's very important. There's something else I want to say about Martin Luther King Jr. He's one of my heroes, and he's probably one of yours too, and for good reason. And it is for good reason that we have a national holiday honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His courage and his accomplishments are beyond dispute, and he played a major role in changing American society, or at least setting it further down the road for change. However, I think that it's almost kind of sad that all the attention is put on Martin Luther King Jr. to the extent that we forget about all the other people who were standing side by side with him, including in leadership positions, who were part of the same struggle, as well as we often forget about the people who came before him that he looked to for inspiration in the civil rights movement. It almost seems sometimes that as a society, as a culture, we have decided to declare Martin Luther King Jr. as our martyr and to have him symbolize all the struggle, all the accomplishments, all the civil rights movement, completely like incarnated within him. And I feel like that's inappropriate. I don't feel like that's what he would have wanted. Another thing that I notice a lot of times is that people will say, you know, whenever something comes up that pertains to race relations, particularly, you will hear people say, "Oh, I wonder what Martin Luther King would have thought of this. I bet he would not have approved." I just, uh, I just can't believe. I tend to think that this is what people say. Martin Luther King would believe fill in the blank, whatever that person believes. Um, it's true, he's been gone since 1968, but the people who worked with him, the people who shared with him in the struggle that started there in Montgomery in 1955 and continued onward, and which really was part of a larger overall struggle. Um, but those people were around for a whole lot longer, and some of them are still around today. So when people speculate about what Dr. King would have thought, a lot of times they completely ignore what all the people who worked with him still think, right? I mean, odds are his line of thinking would be similar to theirs. So that's just this. I don't know. It's almost a way of appropriating Dr. King, and I feel like we should make some extra effort to acknowledge the people who worked with him, just like we should acknowledge Claudette Colvin, along with Rosa Parks. So now we've got people that we've talked about here that, well, I hope you remember them because they're on the study guide. People like E.D. Nixon, who was the chair of the local NAACP. He also happened to be the chair of the local chapter of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was that thing that A. Philip Randolph had played such a large role in, and the Baptist preacher Ralph Abernathy, who not only was side by side with Dr. King in these efforts, but also as the years went on, was very active with Dr. King and sort of picked up on a lot of Dr. King's stuff after uh, MLK was assassinated. People like Bayard Rustin, who had been in this fight for many years already and had been an inspiration to Martin Luther King, and now is once more part of the action, part of the fray. So I think that it is incumbent upon us to, particularly when Black History Month rolls around, the tendency is to show pictures of Martin Luther King all the time and talk about Dr. King all the time. Maybe go back to the 19th century and talk about Harriet Tubman, maybe Frederick Douglass. But more attention needs to be given to these other individuals and others that we've talked about in this class already, and many others that we are still going to be talking about. All right. Well, with that said, what I'm going to do now is share with you just a portion of one of Dr. King's speeches during the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, there's only audio for this. It was recorded on a tape recorder. I think it was a speech that he gave at a meeting that was in the Dexter Street Baptist Church. So there's no video, but I'm going to put up the words so that you can follow along because the sound quality isn't the best. But this is a good way to demonstrate some of the speaking ability that he had. Now I know you're all familiar with that. This ties into what I was saying before. When people talk about Dr. King and when Black History Month rolls around, they talk about that one speech during the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech. And that's a wonderful speech, but it's not the only thing he ever said. Um, he said a lot of other stuff on a lot of other pertinent topics that tend to also get neglected. So even though this is just a basic survey course, and you're uh, part of this is part of a very broad subject area. Try to do that. Okay. All right. So let's hear what he had to say in 1955. Well, apparently the audio to this speech is copyrighted and I can't share it with you. So you might want to just hit pause and read it. It's a pretty cool speech. In January 1957, shortly after the Supreme Court decision about the bus segregation came down, Dr. King and Bayard Rustin were among several who had been involved in the Montgomery boycott. Ralph Abernathy was another who spearheaded the organization of a new group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. This is another of those acronyms that one needs to remember in reference to the civil rights movement. So, initially, there were about 60 members from all around the American South. It was envisioned as being the political arm of the black church. So, a loose affiliation of African American church leaders whose goal was to advance the cause of civil rights. Dr. King was the first president of the SCLC and the first permanent staff member, and for a long time the only paid staff member, was this woman, Ella Baker. She was the associate director of the SCLC. That was the staff position that she held. Ella Baker was a powerful, powerful speaker and organizer. She was in her mid-50s at this time, and she had been very active since the 1930s in organizing and activism as a member of the NAACP and other things. She had hosted several leadership conferences over the years. She is going to be not only very important in this group, but other groups that are going to come about within a few years in the 1960s. So, with the formation of the SCLC, this had gone from a Montgomery movement, a citywide movement, to something national. And here is a timeline just to help you keep straight when these things happened. They all happened right around the mid 50s, right? So the decision of Brown versus Board was May 1954. Then the following year in March, Claudette Colvin was arrested. Emmett Till was murdered that summer, 1955. And yes, you see that correctly. The acquittal of his killers came just about a month after the murder. That's how quickly injustice moved in Mississippi. Then in December of 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery and the boycott began. The Supreme Court case about the bus segregation was handed down in November, almost 1 year later, 1956. So the boycott ended in December of 56, and the following month, January 57, the SCLC was formed.